The bride was waiting at the altar, the guests were raising their glasses, and the cowboy groom suddenly walked away from the wedding he was supposed to celebrate. The music stopped as Caleb Whitmore stepped into the crowded hall, leaving behind a future everyone expected him to accept. Outside the kitchen door, Clara Bennett stood frozen with her worn apron in her hands, unaware that the feast she cooked in silence had just placed her at the center of a choice that would shake the entire valley. Stay with this story to discover why the groom turned away from his bride. Subscribe and follow along for more unforgettable Western stories. The Whitmore Ranch had never seen a gathering like this. By noon, wagons lined the long dirt road leading up from the valley, their wooden wheels leaving pale tracks through the dry Montana soil. Riders came down from the mountain trails wearing their best coats and polished boots. Families from nearby settlements arrived carrying gifts wrapped in cloth and small wooden boxes tied with twine. The Bitterroot Mountains stood tall in the distance, their snowy peaks shining beneath the summer sun. The ranch itself looked different that day. Fresh flowers hung along the porch rails. Lanterns had been placed beneath the trees. The wide yard that usually held cattle and working horses had been cleared for music, dancing, and celebration. It was the wedding day of Caleb Whitmore. Everyone in the valley knew his name. Caleb owned one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. He was the kind of man people respected from a distance. Quiet, reliable. A cowboy who could spend 10 hours in the saddle and return home without saying much about the day. Men trusted his handshake. Neighbors trusted his word. But very few people knew what Caleb Whitmore wanted, and even fewer knew what he was willing to give up. Behind the main house, away from the music and the guests, the ranch kitchen was still warm from the morning fires. The room smelled of fresh bread, roasted meat, cinnamon, and baked fruit. Copper pots hung above the stove. Wooden shelves held jars of preserves and carefully labeled sacks of flour. Every surface showed the marks of hard work. In the center of it all stood Clara Bennett. Her hands moved slowly as she checked the final trays before they were carried into the dining hall. She had been awake since before dawn. The bread had been shaped before sunrise. The pies had been pulled from the oven at exactly the right moment. The sauces had been tasted and adjusted until there was nothing left to improve. 6 weeks of work had led to this day. 6 weeks of early mornings. 6 weeks of standing over hot stoves while the rest of the ranch slept. Clara looked at the 4-tier wedding cake sitting near the window. It was not the kind of cake most people expected from a ranch kitchen. The layers were covered in smooth ivory frosting. Small handmade flowers climbed around the sides. Every detail had been shaped by her own hands. She touched the edge of the table beside it. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel proud. Then she heard laughter, not from the guests outside, from the hallway. Clara stopped moving. The kitchen door was slightly open. Voices carried through the narrow space between the rooms. She recognized one of them immediately. Vivian Caldwell, the bride. Clara lowered the cloth in her hands and stepped closer. Not because she wanted to listen, but because the voices were close and the words had already reached her. "I will admit," Vivian said, her voice smooth and pleasant. "The meal turned out better than I expected." Another woman laughed softly. "I imagine you were relieved." "Oh, completely," Vivian replied. "You never know what you'll get when you hire someone from outside these circles." Clara stood still. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen towel. "The woman worked hard," Vivian continued. "I'll give her that." A pause followed. Then came the sentence that made Clara's shoulders become perfectly still. "But she understands what she is. More laughter. Quiet, polite. The kind of laughter that hurt worse because nobody thought they were being cruel." "She is only the cook," Vivian said. "The guests came here for the wedding, not to meet the woman behind the meals." Someone asked something Clara could not hear clearly. Vivian answered, "She should be grateful. A person like that does not usually get the chance to work in a house like this." Clara looked down at herself, at the simple blue dress beneath her apron, at the flour dust on her sleeves, at the small burn mark near her wrist from a pan she had grabbed too quickly 3 days earlier. She had heard words like those before, not exactly the same, but close enough. People who looked at her body before they looked at her face. People who decided what kind of life she could have before she ever spoke. She had learned a long time ago that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind, so she did what she always did. She breathed in, slowly, then she turned back toward the kitchen. The door opened behind her a moment later. May Ellis, the Whitmore Ranch housekeeper, stepped inside carrying a stack of folded linens. May was older, with silver beginning to show in her brown hair. She had worked at the ranch for years and knew every corner of the property better than anyone. She looked at Clara, noticed the silence, noticed the way Clara had stopped working. "You heard them," May said quietly. Clara did not answer right away. Outside, a burst of laughter rose from the yard. Someone began playing a fiddle. The wedding continued. "I have orders to finish," Clara said. May set the linens down. "That isn't what I asked." Clara folded the kitchen towel carefully. The movement was calm, almost too calm. "I came here to cook," she said. "That is what I was paid to do." May watched her. "You made half this ranch smell like home for 6 weeks. Clara gave a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "And tomorrow everyone will remember the wedding." She looked toward the kitchen door, not the woman who made the food. For a moment, May had no answer. Clara walked to the small room beside the kitchen where she had kept her belongings. There was not much. A worn leather bag, a folded shawl, her mother's old cast-iron skillet wrapped carefully in cloth, a small roll containing her best knives. She packed each item with the same care she used when preparing a meal. No anger, no scene, no tears, just a woman who had decided she had stayed long enough. When she returned to the kitchen, the noise outside seemed louder. The guests were gathering for the reception. The wedding bells had already rung. Caleb Whitmore was supposed to be standing beside Vivian Caldwell beneath the white flowers on the front porch, beginning a life everyone else had planned for him. Clara tied the strap of her bag. She reached for the kitchen door, then she stopped. Because from the other side of the ranch, a sound carried across the yard. A voice. Caleb Whitmore's voice. It was not the voice of a man giving a wedding speech. It was the voice of a man who had finally made a decision. The music stopped, the conversations faded, and all across the Whitmore Ranch, people turned to see what was happening. Clara stood behind the kitchen door, one hand resting on the handle. She did not know yet what Caleb had said. She did not know that the wedding everyone had traveled miles to witness was about to fall apart. She did not know that the cowboy she believed belonged to someone else was about to choose a different path. All she knew was that she had come to the Whitmore Ranch to cook a wedding feast, and before that day ended, the entire valley would be asking why the groom walked away from the bride and toward the woman who was never supposed to be seen. 6 weeks earlier, before the music, before the flowers, before the long tables filled with guests from across Montana territory, Clara Bennett was standing on a small wooden ladder beside her farmhouse roof, trying to patch a leak before the next storm arrived. The wind moved across the open land with the same stubborn force it always had. Pine Hollow sat in a quiet stretch of the Bitterroot Valley, far enough from the larger settlements that a person could ride for hours without seeing another house. The mountains stood beyond the fields like old guardians, their peaks still holding snow even as summer approached. Clara had always loved that about the place. The land did not pretend to be easy, it asked for work, and if you gave it enough, sometimes it gave something back. She climbed down from the roof and placed the hammer beside the porch steps. The nails she had bought in town were almost gone. She counted what remained in the small paper bag from the hardware store, and already knew they would not be enough for the repairs waiting inside the house. The fence on the north side needed replacing. The barn door hung crooked. The well pump had started making a strange sound that usually meant trouble. Everything on a farm seemed to speak if a person listened closely enough. Clara listened. She just did not always have the means to answer. Inside the kitchen was warm from the morning fire. It was the smallest room in the farmhouse, but it was the one place where everything felt familiar. A wooden table sat near the window. Her mother's old cast-iron skillet rested on a shelf above the stove. A row of jars filled with dried herbs and preserved fruit lined the wall. Clara moved through the room without thinking. She knew every sound the floorboards made. She knew which cabinet door needed an extra push before it closed. She knew exactly how much flour remained in the sack near the pantry. She had learned to make every little thing last. That was how she had survived the years after losing her husband. Not with grand plans, not with promises. One careful day at a time. Her late husband, Samuel, had loved the land more than anything except her. He had believed their small farm could become something if they stayed patient. But the winter he died had been the hardest winter Clara could remember. A fever took him before spring arrived. After that, the farm became hers alone. Some people in Pine Hollow expected her to sell. A widow running a farm by herself was something many folks found surprising. Clara never understood why. The cattle still needed feeding, the fences still needed fixing, the soil still needed planting. The land did not care whether the hands working it belonged to a man or a woman. It only cared whether the work was done. That afternoon, Clara returned from town with a small sack of coffee, a receipt folded carefully inside her coat pocket, and a letter she had picked up from the post office. The letter was waiting on the kitchen table when she arrived. The paper was thick, better quality than most letters she received. She removed her gloves and looked at the name written across the front. Miss Clara Bennett, Whitmore Ranch. She knew the name. Everyone in the valley knew the name. Caleb Whitmore's ranch stretched across thousands of acres. His cattle moved through some of the best grazing land near the mountains. People spoke about the place with a kind of respect usually reserved for old families and large fortunes. Clara sat at the table. For a moment, she simply looked at the envelope, then she opened it. The letter was short. The Whitmore family was preparing for a wedding. A large one. They required an experienced cook capable of preparing a feast for guests arriving from several towns. The work would last 6 weeks. The payment was enough to cover the repairs on her farmhouse, enough to keep the bank from asking difficult questions, enough to give her breathing room. Clara read the amount twice. $40. She placed the letter beside her coffee cup. $40 could buy a lot of things. New roofing materials, feed for the animals, a repairman for the well. It could buy time. And time was something she had not had much of lately. The next morning, Clara wrote her reply. She did not write a long letter. She never had. She thanked them for the offer. She accepted. That was all. 3 days later, she began preparing. Her kitchen became a place of lists and measurements. She wrote down quantities for flour, sugar, meat, vegetables, and spices. She calculated how many loaves of bread would be needed, how many pies, how much coffee, how much room would be required for cooling trays. She packed her knives carefully in cloth. She wrapped her mother's cast-iron skillet in an old blanket. Before leaving, she walked through the farmhouse one last time, the small bedroom, the narrow hallway, the kitchen where she had spent countless mornings. Her hand rested on the doorframe. She was not leaving forever. At least she hoped not. She was only going to work. That was all. On the morning she left for Whitmore Ranch, the sky was pale gray, and the air carried the smell of rain. Clara loaded her things into a small wagon. Her dress was plain, her coat was old but warm. She had no reason to impress anyone. She was not going to a social gathering, she was going to a kitchen. The road from Pine Hollow to the Whitmore Ranch took most of the day. The wagon rolled past open fields, scattered homesteads, and tall stands of pine trees climbing the mountain slopes. Clara kept one hand on the reins and the other resting near the list of supplies tucked inside her coat. As the afternoon light stretched across the valley, the Whitmore ranch finally appeared. Large wooden fences, wide pasture land, a main house sitting above the fields, stable buildings nearby, smoke rising from the chimney. It was the kind of place built by people who expected it to last longer than they would. Clara slowed the wagon near the entrance gate. She looked toward the ranch house, then she looked down at her hands. Hands marked by years of work. Hands that had planted gardens, repaired fences, cooked meals, and held on to a life that could have easily slipped away. She took a breath. Then she drove forward. She did not know that within 6 weeks, those same hands would create a feast people across the valley would remember. She did not know that a cowboy who had spent years choosing duty over happiness would begin finding reasons to walk into her kitchen before sunrise. She did not know that the greatest change waiting for her at Whitmore Ranch would have nothing to do with money. For now, Clara Bennett was simply a widow from Pine Hollow, arriving at a wealthy ranch with a box of tools, a worn skillet, and one simple goal: earn enough to save her home. Nothing more. That was the thought Clara Bennett carried with her as the wagon rolled through the front gate of Whitmore Ranch. The ranch hands looked up from their work as she passed. Not because she arrived loudly, she did not. Clara had never been the kind of person who entered a place demanding attention. She guided the wagon carefully over the uneven ground, stopped near the main house, and climbed down with the same quiet confidence she carried into every room. A young ranch hand approached and tipped his hat. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes. I'm Thomas Reed. Mr. Whitmore asked me to show you where the kitchen is and where you can keep your things." "Thank you, Mr. Reed." Thomas lifted one of her bags before she could protest. "It's a long walk from the gate. I can carry it." "I don't doubt that," he said with a small smile. "But I can still help." Clara looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." The kitchen was larger than she expected, much larger. It had 2 iron stoves, wide wooden counters, shelves filled with jars and spices, and a stone hearth big enough to warm the entire room on cold mornings. Clara stepped inside and stopped. For a moment, she forgot about the money, forgot about the repairs waiting at home, forgot about the reason she had come. This was a kitchen built by someone who understood the importance of feeding people. The knives were properly stored, the work tables were solid, the storage room was organized. Someone had built this place with care. Clara placed her hand on the edge of the nearest counter. Then she quietly removed her coat. Within minutes, she was already inspecting supplies. She counted flour sacks, checked the condition of the vegetables, opened the cold storage room. She made notes in her small notebook. A cook who waited until the last minute was already behind. Clara had learned that lesson years ago. Preparation was how she kept fear from taking control. She was still writing when the kitchen door opened. Clara turned. The man standing there was not dressed like the wealthy owner of a large ranch, at least not the way she expected. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled slightly above his wrists. His boots carried dust from the fields. His hat was in his hand, not on his head. He looked like a man who spent more time outside than inside. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Afternoon, afternoon." His eyes moved briefly around the kitchen, then back to her. "You must be Clara Bennett." "Yes, sir," he nodded. "Caleb Whitmore." She already knew. Everyone in the valley knew. Still, she gave him the courtesy of pretending they had just met. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked toward the shelves. "You've already started. I wanted to know what I was working with. That makes sense." A pause followed. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. Caleb seemed like a man who did not fill silence simply because silence existed. "I hope the kitchen is suitable," he said. "It is." "Good." Another pause. Then he glanced toward her notebook. You always make lists? Yes. Why? Clara looked at him. Because things go wrong when people assume they won't. Something changed slightly in his expression. Not a smile, something smaller, like he respected the answer. I suppose that's true. Before Clara could respond, a woman's voice came from the doorway. Caleb. The tone was gentle, but it carried expectation. Both of them turned. Vivian Caldwell stood there. She was dressed beautifully, even for an ordinary afternoon. Her traveling dress was made from fine fabric, and every detail about her appearance suggested a life far different from Clara's. Vivian stepped into the kitchen. Her eyes moved over the room, then to Clara. So this is the cook. Clara straightened. Yes, ma'am. Clara Bennett. Vivian gave a small nod. I read your references. Thank you. I hope you understand what is expected. I do my best work when expectations are clear. Vivian looked at her for a moment. Then she walked slowly toward the table. The wedding will have important guests. People traveling from Helena, Missoula, and even farther east. I understand. There will be certain standards. I understand. Vivian's eyes briefly moved over Clara's simple dress, then returned to her face. You are here because you have a skill. The words sounded polite, but there was something cold beneath them. Clara noticed. She had spent enough years around people to recognize when kindness was only decoration. I intend to use that skill well. Good. Vivian turned toward Caleb. Father wants to speak with you before dinner. Caleb nodded. I'll be there. Vivian waited. For a moment, it seemed like she expected him to follow immediately. When he did not move, something passed through her expression. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. I'll see you soon. She left. The kitchen became quiet again. Caleb watched the doorway after she was gone. Clara returned her attention to her notes. She did not ask questions. It was not her place. After a moment, Caleb said, She can be direct. Clara looked up. I noticed. A faint breath escaped him. Almost a laugh. Almost, I suppose that is one way to describe it. Clara looked back down at her notebook. She cares about the wedding. Yes. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. But Clara did not comment. Caleb looked at the kitchen once more. You'll have everything you need? I believe so. If you don't, tell someone. I will. He nodded. Then he walked away. Clara watched the door close behind him, only briefly. Then she went back to work. The days that followed moved quickly. The ranch became busier with every passing morning. Deliveries arrived. Crates of supplies were unloaded. Clara checked every receipt. She inspected every ingredient. She spoke with the ranch workers who helped bring things in. She learned names. She remembered preferences. One ranch hand liked his coffee strong. Another preferred his bread darker. Little things, things most people never noticed. But Clara noticed. That was how she cooked. That was how she lived. A week passed, then another. The wedding preparations grew larger. More wagons arrived. More people came through the ranch, and through it all, Clara remained in the kitchen. Exactly where Vivian wanted her. Until one early morning, just before sunrise, the kitchen door opened again. Clara looked up from the bread dough. Caleb Whitmore stood there. This time, he carried no papers, no business matters, only a coffee mug in his hand. Morning, he said. Clara looked at the clock on the wall. The sun had not reached the mountains yet. Morning. He glanced toward the stove. Mind if I sit for a minute? Clara looked at the empty chair near the far end of the table, then back at him. It's your ranch, Mr. Whitmore. He pulled out the chair. Maybe, he sat. But you're the one keeping this kitchen running. For the first time since arriving at Whitmore Ranch, Clara did not immediately know what to say, so she simply turned back to the bread, and Caleb sat quietly with his coffee as the first light of morning entered through the kitchen window. Neither of them knew it yet. But that small moment before sunrise would become the beginning of something neither of them had planned. At first, Clara Bennett told herself it meant nothing. Caleb Whitmore had simply found a quiet place to drink his coffee. That was all. The Whitmore ranch was large, and large places needed quiet corners. The kitchen happened to be one of them. Clara understood that. She did not allow herself to imagine anything beyond that simple explanation. The next morning, before the first light reached over the Bitterroot Mountains, she heard the back door open again. The sound was familiar already. Boots against the wooden floor, a hat placed gently on the table, the small scrape of a chair moving backward. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning." He poured himself coffee from the pot she had prepared before dawn. Clara continued working. The dough beneath her hands needed attention, and she had never been a person who abandoned a task halfway through because someone entered the room. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the stove fire and the quiet rhythm of her hands working the dough. Outside, the ranch slowly woke. A horse moved inside the nearby stable. A gate opened somewhere in the distance. A ranch hand called out to another worker. But inside the kitchen, the morning remained still. After a while, Caleb looked toward the bread. "How do you know when it's ready?" Clara glanced over. "The bread?" He nodded. She wiped a small amount of flour from her fingers. "You listen." He looked at her. "Listen?" She picked up one loaf from the tray. "When you tap the bottom, it tells you." She turned the bread slightly. "A hollow sound means it's done." She tapped the bottom. The sound was light and firm. "A heavier sound means it needs more time." Caleb leaned slightly forward. "And you can tell that just by hearing it?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That's something." Clara looked back at the dough. "It's not special. I didn't say it was." The answer caught her attention. She looked at him. Caleb held the coffee mug with both hands, looking at the loaf instead of her. "I just said it's something." For some reason, that stayed with her. Most people who noticed her skills either wanted something from her or treated them like simple chores. Caleb spoke about them as if they mattered. A few mornings later, he came in while Clara was preparing pie crust. He watched quietly for a moment. "What's in there?" She looked up. "The crust?" He nodded. "Flour, butter, a little salt. Anything else?" Clara hesitated. "Cold water." He waited. She noticed. "You're expecting more. I'm listening." That almost made her smile. Almost. A small amount of vinegar. "Why?" "To keep the crust from becoming too tough." Caleb looked genuinely interested. "Most people would never know the difference. Most people eat too quickly." He looked down at the coffee in his hand. "My mother used to say something like that." Clara slowed her hands. "She cooked?" "She did." A quiet expression crossed his face. "She believed a meal told you something about the person who made it." Clara looked at him. "My grandmother said something similar." Caleb looked back. "What did she say?" Clara placed the rolling pin down. "She said food remembers the hands that made it." For a moment, neither of them moved. The words sat between them. Not heavy, just present. Caleb looked toward the window. The morning light had started reaching across the fields. "My mother would have liked this kitchen." Clara looked around. "It's a good kitchen," he nodded. "It is." There was something in the way he said it. Not pride, something closer to appreciation. Then he stood. "I should let you work." "You were not in the way." He stopped near the door. It was a simple sentence. But he looked back at her as if it meant more than she intended. "Good morning, Miss Bennett." "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." After he left, Clara returned to her work, but she found herself thinking about the conversation longer than she expected. Not about him. She told herself that. About the conversation, about how rare it was for someone to ask questions and actually wait for the answer. That was all. The days continued. The wedding preparations grew larger. More supplies arrived at the ranch. More workers moved through the property. Clara became part of the daily rhythm of Whitmore Ranch, without ever truly becoming part of the household. She knew the names of the ranch hands. She knew which horses needed slower handling. She knew which delivery company often arrived late, and which supplier always packed the wrong amount of sugar. But she also knew the boundaries. Vivian Caldwell reminded her of them whenever necessary. One afternoon, Vivian entered the kitchen while Clara was organizing jars in the storage room. "The guest list has grown," Vivian said. Clara turned. "Yes, ma'am. There will be people here from important families." "I understand." Vivian looked around the kitchen. "Everything must appear effortless." Clara nodded. "It will." Vivian's eyes rested on her for a moment. "I hope you remember that the kitchen is where you belong during the celebration." The words were polite, almost gentle, but they carried the same meaning. "Stay here. Do not step outside. Do not become visible." Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "I understand." Vivian left. Clara waited until the door closed. Then she continued working. That evening, a storm rolled down from the mountains. The wind came hard against the ranch buildings. Rain struck the roof. The cattle moved uneasily in the fields. By morning, everyone was busy checking damage. A section of fencing near the northern pasture had broken. One of the storage sheds had taken a heavy hit from the wind. And near the eastern side of the property, several horses had been moved into a smaller shelter because part of the main structure had weakened. Caleb stood outside the stable with 2 ranch hands, looking over the damaged beams. Clara happened to be carrying supplies from the kitchen when she saw him. She stopped. The roofline did not look right. She had spent years repairing her own farm. She knew what weak structures looked like. Caleb noticed her standing there. "Everything all right?" Clara looked toward the shelter. "May I ask something?" He nodded. "Of course." She pointed toward the support beam near the corner. That was already bending before the storm. One of the ranch hands looked over. It held. Clara nodded. "It did." She looked back at Caleb. "But it won't hold another one." The men were quiet. Caleb walked closer. "What makes you think that?" She hesitated, not because she did not know, because she was not used to people asking her opinion outside the kitchen. "The wood is pulling away near the joint." She stepped closer but stopped before entering their space. The storm did not cause the weakness. It only showed it. Caleb looked at the beam, then back at her. "How would you fix it?" The question surprised her, not because she knew the answer, because he asked as if he expected one. "Add support before replacing the whole section." She pointed toward another post. "The weight is shifting here." Caleb studied the structure. The ranch hands looked at each other. Then one of them stepped forward. "She may be right, Mr. Whitmore." Caleb remained quiet. Then he nodded. "Let's check it." By afternoon, they had reinforced the shelter. The next night, another storm came through. The wind was stronger, the rain heavier, but the shelter held. The horses remained safe. The next morning, Caleb found Clara in the kitchen. He stood near the doorway holding his coffee. "You were right," she looked up. "That's good." He waited. She expected him to say more. Instead, he simply nodded. "Thank you. It was such a small thing." 2 words, but Clara noticed them, because Caleb Whitmore was not the kind of man who said things he did not mean. She returned to her work. He sat at the far end of the table, and for the first time, the silence between them felt less like 2 strangers sharing a room. It felt like something neither of them had named yet, something growing quietly before sunrise. And for a while, Clara Bennett allowed herself to believe that maybe quiet things were the safest things. A person could work. A person could keep their head down. A person could appreciate a kindness without asking for more than it was. That was how Clara had lived most of her life. She understood hard work. She understood patience. And she understood that some doors were not meant to be opened. But the days at Whitmore Ranch had begun to change the shape of her mornings. Not because Caleb Whitmore said anything remarkable most days. He did not. He came into the kitchen before sunrise, poured coffee into the same dark ceramic mug, and sat at the far end of the table while Clara prepared breakfast. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. And somehow, the silence never felt uncomfortable. It reminded Clara of sitting beside someone during a long wagon ride. Two people looking at the same road. No need to fill every mile with words. By the 5th week before the wedding, the ranch had fallen into a familiar rhythm. Clara woke before dawn. She checked the fires. She prepared bread. She measured ingredients carefully and wrote notes in the small book she kept tucked beside her flour bin. Caleb arrived sometime between the first rooster crow and the moment sunlight touched the mountain peaks. Always the same. Always quiet. One morning, he entered the kitchen carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Clara looked up. "What is that?" He placed it on the table. "Something I thought you might need." She wiped her hands on her apron and walked closer. Inside was a set of new wooden measuring spoons. Not expensive, not decorated, just well made. Clara looked at them. "My old ones work, I know." She looked at him. "Then why replace them?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "Because I noticed the handle on the largest one was cracked." Clara picked up the spoon. The crack was small, barely visible. She had stopped noticing it months ago. "You noticed that?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Yes." She looked down at the spoons again. "Thank you." Caleb nodded once, then he reached for his coffee. The moment passed, but Clara kept the spoons, not because they were new, because someone had noticed something she had learned to ignore. That was different. Very different. A few days later, the ranch received a delivery of lumber for repairs. Clara was carrying a basket of supplies from the storage room when she saw Caleb speaking with two men near the main barn. One of the men was older, wearing a dark coat despite the warmth of the afternoon. Clara did not recognize him. The conversation ended quickly when she approached. Caleb noticed her. "Everything all right?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." She lifted the basket slightly. "Just bringing these inside." The older man looked toward her, only briefly, but long enough for Clara to recognize the expression. The same one she had seen many times. A person deciding what someone was worth before hearing them speak. Caleb noticed. His face changed slightly. Not anger, something quieter, disapproval. The older man tipped his hat. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Dawson." The man left. Clara continued toward the kitchen. She did not ask. Caleb did not explain. But later that evening, when he came for coffee, he seemed distracted. The ranch owner, who usually sat quietly, appeared somewhere else in his thoughts. Clara noticed. She always noticed. "You have a lot on your mind." Caleb looked up. For a moment he seemed ready to deny it. Then he did not. "Some things." She nodded. She did not push. After a moment he said, "Do you ever wonder if people see what they want to see?" Clara continued slicing vegetables. "Yes." "Does that bother you?" The knife stopped. Only for a second. Then she continued, "Sometimes." Caleb looked at her. "Sometimes," Clara placed the vegetables into a bowl. "Sometimes people are wrong about you." A pause. "And sometimes they are right about the parts of you that you are still trying to understand." Caleb was quiet. "That sounds like experience talking." "It is." The answer was simple. She did not offer details. He respected that. Another week passed. The wedding preparations became more demanding. Clara worked longer hours. The kitchen grew busier. There were new deliveries almost every day, boxes of glassware, sacks of flour, fresh produce brought from nearby farms. The wedding was becoming the largest event the valley had seen that year. And with every passing day, Vivian Caldwell seemed more determined to make sure everything appeared perfect. One afternoon, Vivian entered the kitchen while Clara was preparing decorations for the cake. The bride stopped near the work table. For a moment, she simply looked. The sugar flowers, the careful arrangement, the detailed design. "It is impressive," Vivian said. Clara looked up. "Thank you." Vivian reached toward one of the flowers but did not touch it. "I suppose this is why my father recommended you." Clara waited. Vivian looked at the cake. "You understand that on the wedding day, guests will remember the celebration. Yes, they will remember the bride." Clara nodded. "Yes." Vivian finally looked directly at her. "But not everyone who contributes to an event becomes part of the event." The meaning was clear. Clara lowered her eyes back to the flowers. "I understand." Vivian stood there for another moment. Then she left. Clara continued working. But that evening, when Caleb came into the kitchen, he noticed something. The cake decorations were more precise than usual. Almost too precise. "You changed the design." Clara looked up, only slightly. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because the original idea would not hold." Caleb stepped closer. "The cake? Yes." He looked at the drawings beside the work table, then at her. "Did someone tell you to change it?" "No." "Then why?" Clara met his eyes. "Because it needed to be done." Caleb studied her for a moment, then he nodded. "That's a good reason." The answer was simple, but it mattered, because Clara had spent years explaining herself to people who had already decided they did not want to understand. Caleb listened first. That was becoming harder for her to ignore. The next morning, another storm came down from the mountains. The wind arrived before the rain, strong enough to shake the windows. The ranch workers hurried outside to secure equipment and check the animals. Clara was helping prepare food for the workers when she heard shouting from outside. Not panic, concern. She stepped onto the back porch. Near the eastern pasture, several ranch hands were trying to move cattle away from a damaged section of fencing. The ground was soaked, the horses were restless. Caleb was already there. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her coat. She walked toward the pasture. One of the ranch hands saw her. "Miss Bennett, you should get inside." She looked at the broken fence, then at the direction the cattle were moving. "The water is pushing them toward the lower field." The man frowned. "That's where we're trying to move them." "No." She pointed toward the muddy ground. "The lower field will hold water." Caleb turned. "What would you do?" The question came quickly, not as a challenge, as a request. Clara looked over the pasture, the west side. A ranch hand shook his head. "That path is narrow." Yes, Clara said. "But it's higher ground." Caleb followed her gaze. Then he looked at the fence. A few seconds passed. Finally, he nodded. "Move them west." The men followed his order. By the time the storm passed, the cattle were safe. The damaged fence could be repaired. The loss was far smaller than it could have been. That evening, Clara returned to the kitchen tired and covered with mud at the bottom of her boots. She expected criticism. Instead, when Caleb entered later, he placed something beside her on the table. A clean towel. "You forgot this outside." She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." He nodded. After a moment, he said, "You were right today." Clara looked down. "I was lucky." "No." The answer was immediate. "You paid attention." She looked at him. Caleb leaned against the table. "Most people see a kitchen and think that's where you belong." His voice was quiet. "But I've watched you for weeks." A pause. "You see things other people miss." Clara did not know what to say, so she looked away. Outside, the rainwater moved slowly down the windows. The kitchen fire cracked softly, and for the first time in years, Clara Bennett wondered what it would feel like to be known for more than what her hands could make. The thought surprised her. She had never been someone who looked for approval. Approval did not repair fences, it did not pay feed bills, it did not keep rain from coming through a damaged roof. Clara had learned early that a person could not build a life waiting for someone else to notice the work being done. Still, there was something different about being seen, not praised, not admired, simply seen. Caleb Whitmore had a way of noticing things most people ignored: a cracked measuring spoon, a weak support beam, a tired horse standing slightly apart from the others, and somehow, without making a show of it, he had started noticing Clara too. That was the part she was careful with, because Clara knew the difference between kindness and promises. Kindness could be accepted. Promises could break a person if they were built on something unsteady. So she continued doing what she had always done. She worked, she prepared, she kept moving, but the quiet mornings were becoming harder to dismiss. The coffee, the conversations, the way Caleb listened, as if her answers mattered. By the third week before the wedding, the ranch had become a place where everyone seemed to know exactly what was happening. Everyone except Clara. Or perhaps she was the only one pretending not to know. Vivian Caldwell noticed first. She noticed when Caleb started arriving in the kitchen earlier than necessary. She noticed when he asked Clara questions that had nothing to do with the wedding. She noticed when he looked toward the kitchen during meals, not because something needed attention, but because he wanted to know whether Clara was there. Vivian noticed everything. She had been raised in a world where every movement carried meaning, every handshake, every invitation, every business conversation held behind closed doors. Her father had taught her that people rarely revealed what they wanted directly. You watched, you waited, you learned, and Vivian had learned. One afternoon, she stood near the front porch of the main house while Caleb reviewed ranch records with his foreman. Her eyes followed the path toward the kitchen. You spend a great deal of time there. Caleb looked up from the papers. Where? Vivian did not answer immediately. She did not need to. The kitchen. He folded the document in his hand. I drink coffee there. You have always taken coffee in the house. Yes, with me. The words hung between them. Caleb looked away briefly. Vivian, I am not accusing you of anything. Her voice was calm. That was what made it difficult. Vivian rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. I simply find it interesting that 6 weeks before our wedding, you have suddenly found so much comfort in the company of a woman who works for us. Caleb's expression tightened slightly. She is a person, Vivian, I know that. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. I am only saying that people notice things. Caleb looked toward the fields. The afternoon sun stretched across the grasslands. People always notice what they want to notice. Vivian studied him. Then she smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach her eyes. Perhaps she walked away before the conversation could continue, but the concern in her face did not leave with her. That evening, Vivian wrote a letter, not to Caleb, to her father. The letter was brief, carefully worded. She did not accuse. She did not exaggerate. She simply told him that Caleb Whitmore appeared less certain than before, and that uncertainty was dangerous. The next morning, Clara received an unexpected visitor. A woman named Margaret Ellis arrived at the kitchen door carrying a basket of fresh eggs. She was one of the older neighbors who supplied the ranch. Clara knew her only by sight. Mrs. Bennett. Good morning. Margaret handed over the basket. Mr. Whitmore asked me to bring these. Clara looked surprised. Why? The kitchen has been using more than usual. Clara nodded. She reached for her purse. Margaret shook her head. Already paid. Clara stopped. He paid, yes, that was not unusual, but something about it bothered her, not because it was wrong, because Caleb had done it quietly, without expecting thanks, without making sure she knew. Margaret smiled slightly. You have a good employer. Clara looked down at the eggs. Yes, she meant it. And that was the problem, because she had started to mean things she had not planned to mean. Later that afternoon, Clara was organizing supplies when she heard voices from the hallway. She recognized Vivian. The other voice belonged to a man she had never heard before. Older, rougher. The conversation was not meant for her. She knew that. She should have walked away. But then she heard Caleb's name. The agreement was clear, the man said. Clara stopped. Vivian answered, My father knows what he is doing. He wants the eastern acreage. Yes. A pause. And Caleb? He will understand after the wedding. Clara stood completely still. The eastern acreage. She knew that land. Everyone in the valley did. It was the strongest grazing area on the entire ranch. The grass stayed green longer. Water ran through it even during dry summers. It was the kind of land ranchers spent their entire lives trying to protect. The man lowered his voice. The railroad route will make that property worth far more than cattle ever will. Vivian answered quietly, That is why this marriage matters. Clara felt the weight of those words. The marriage, not the man, not the future, the arrangement. She stepped away before they could see her. Her heart was steady, her hands were not. She returned to the kitchen and placed both palms against the work table. For several minutes, she did nothing. Then she looked around the room, the shelves, the stove, the bread rising beneath the cloth, the kitchen where Caleb had sat every morning. A thought came to her, not a pleasant one, a necessary one. Perhaps she had misunderstood everything. Perhaps those quiet mornings meant nothing. Perhaps Caleb was simply a good man caught inside a complicated situation. And perhaps Clara Bennett was doing exactly what she had always done. Finding meaning in places where she was only passing through. The next morning, Caleb arrived before sunrise. The coffee was already prepared. Clara continued working. He noticed immediately that something was different. You're quiet. I am working. That is usually when you are quiet. She almost smiled. Almost. But then she looked at him, Mr. Whitmore. The use of his name instead of Caleb made him pause. Yes? Is the eastern acreage part of your wedding agreement? The question landed between them. Caleb did not answer immediately. That told her enough. Finally, he set down his coffee cup. Who told you? No one told me. A pause. I overheard something. Caleb looked toward the window. The first light of morning was beginning to appear. Vivian's family wants the land. Clara waited. Does Vivian know? Another silence. Do you? The question surprised him. Caleb looked back. Do I what? Want to give it to them? His face changed, only slightly, but she saw it. No. The answer came without hesitation. Clara nodded. Then why are you marrying her? For the first time, Caleb had no immediate answer. The kitchen remained quiet. The fire burned low. Outside, horses moved through the morning mist. Finally, he said, because sometimes a person convinces himself that doing what is expected is the same thing as doing what is right. Clara looked at him. And is it? Caleb met her eyes. No. The honesty of the answer stayed with her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Caleb picked up his coffee. I should go. Clara nodded. Yes. He walked toward the door, but before leaving, he stopped. Clara. She looked up. I am glad you told me. Then he left, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen, realizing something she had been trying not to admit. The wedding was no longer just about a feast. The land was not just land, and Caleb Whitmore was not simply a cowboy preparing to marry someone else. Something much bigger was coming. And before the last flower was placed on the wedding tables, Everyone at Whitmore Ranch would have to decide what mattered more: a promise made for appearances, or a truth that could no longer be ignored. For the next several days, Clara Bennett tried not to think about that question. She had enough work in front of her. The wedding was approaching. Every hour mattered, every ingredient mattered, every decision mattered. The Whitmore Ranch had become a place of constant movement. Wagons arrived before noon carrying supplies from nearby towns. Ranch hands crossed the yard carrying tables, chairs, and wooden crates. The blacksmith from the settlement repaired a broken hinge on the storage shed. The stable boys worked late preparing horses for guests who would arrive from miles away. Everyone had a task. Clara had hers. She returned to the kitchen each morning before the sun reached the valley floor. The first thing she did was light the stove. The second was start the coffee. The third was check the list. It was the same routine she had followed since arriving. But something had changed. The mornings with Caleb were quieter now, not cold, just careful. After their conversation about the eastern acreage, both of them seemed aware that something had shifted. Caleb still came into the kitchen. He still poured coffee. He still sat at the end of the table, but there were moments when words almost came and then disappeared. Clara noticed. She always noticed. One morning, he placed his coffee cup down and looked toward the window. The mountains looked different every morning. Clara glanced outside. I used to think that was because the weather changed. She waited. Now I think maybe it is because I'm the one looking at them differently. Clara looked back at her work. That happens sometimes. Caleb watched her for a moment. Does it? Yes. She folded a cloth over the rising dough. When a person stays in one place long enough, they start seeing things they missed before. Caleb nodded slowly. That sounds like something you know. Clara did not answer. She did know. She knew because she had spent years looking at the same piece of land and finding something new every season. A new patch of grass, a new crack in the fence, a new way to make something last longer. The morning passed. Neither of them spoke about Vivian. Neither of them spoke about the wedding, but both of them knew those things were sitting in the room with them. The closer the wedding came, the more difficult it became to pretend otherwise. By the final week, the kitchen had become a world of its own. Clara prepared everything herself, not because she refused help, because she understood timing. A meal for a family was one thing. A meal for 200 people was something else entirely. She prepared smoked meats that needed days of attention. She made pies in batches. She tested bread recipes until she found the exact texture she wanted. She prepared sauces and preserves, every shelf slowly filled. Every surface carried evidence of her work. May Ellis often stopped by the kitchen door and watched. One afternoon, she found Clara arranging small sugar flowers beside the cake. You've been staring at those for 10 minutes. Clara looked up. I'm deciding if they're right. May stepped closer. They look right. Clara adjusted one small flower. Almost, May smiled. That is something I have noticed about you. What? You don't stop when something is good. Clara looked down. I stop when it is finished. May shook her head. No, there's a difference. Clara did not answer, because she knew May was right. That was how she had always lived. Always trying to make things better. The roof, the farm, the meals, everything. Perhaps because if something was perfect enough, nobody could question whether she belonged. On the morning before the wedding, Caleb entered the kitchen later than usual. Clara noticed immediately. You're late. The words came out before she thought about them. For a second, she looked surprised that she had said them. Caleb looked at the clock. I am. Everything all right? He removed his hat. Just a meeting that lasted longer than expected. She nodded. She did not ask who the meeting was with. She did not need to. The answer was written in the tired look around his eyes. Caleb walked toward the table, then he stopped. The wedding cake sat near the window, finished. 4 layers, ivory frosting, small flowers climbing along the sides. He stood there quietly. Clara noticed. It is not the final decoration yet. It looks finished. Almost. Caleb stepped closer. You made every flower? Yes. He looked at the cake, then at her. That must have taken a long time. It did. A pause. Why do you do that? Clara looked confused. Do what? Put so much into something people will only see for a few minutes. She thought about the question, then answered honestly, because they deserve those few minutes. Caleb looked at her, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then he nodded. I understand that. He left a short time later. Clara watched him go. Then she returned to the cake. She told herself it was only the conversation, nothing more. The wedding morning arrived with a clear sky, the kind of Montana morning people remembered. The mountains stood bright and sharp against the blue. The grasslands moved gently in the wind. The ranch looked almost unfamiliar. Tables stretched across the yard. White cloth covered the dining area. Lanterns hung from wooden posts. Guests began arriving before noon, men in dark coats, women wearing their finest dresses, families who had traveled from towns Clara had only heard mentioned. She stayed inside, exactly as Vivian had requested. The kitchen door remained closed. The guests praised the decorations. They admired the ranch. They talked about the wedding, and they had no idea that the woman preparing the meal was standing only a few yards away. Clara kept working. She had prepared herself for that. She had never expected applause. She had never expected people to know her name. She only wanted the job finished. That was easier. At midday, Vivian entered the kitchen. She looked different, not just because of the dress, because today was the day she had spent years preparing for. She looked at the cake. For a moment, her expression softened. It is beautiful. Clara looked up. Thank you. Vivian walked closer. I did not think a ranch kitchen could produce something like this. Clara said nothing. Vivian looked at the flowers, then at Clara. You are very talented. It was the closest thing to a compliment Clara had ever received from her. And for a brief moment, Clara wondered if perhaps things could be different. Then Vivian stepped back. But remember, the softness disappeared. Today is about the wedding. Clara nodded. Yes, ma'am. Vivian left. The door closed. Clara returned to work. The ceremony began outside. Through the kitchen walls, she heard the music, a fiddle, a guitar, the sound of people gathering. She heard the guests becoming quiet. She heard the moment everyone waited for. She kept her hands moving. She did not allow herself to imagine Caleb standing at the front of the porch. She did not imagine what he was thinking. She did not imagine whether he looked happy. Instead, she focused on the meal, the first course, the second course, the timing, the details, everything she could control. By afternoon, the food began reaching the guests, and slowly, word returned to the kitchen. May was the one who brought the first message. They loved the bread. Clara nodded. Good. The smoked meat, too. Clara continued arranging plates. Good. May smiled. You know, most people would be pleased. Clara looked at her. I am pleased. May studied her, then nodded. She knew Clara well enough not to push. Later, another ranch hand arrived. The guests are asking who made the pies. Clara stopped, only for a second. Then she returned to her work. What did you tell them? The young man smiled. I told them the truth. Clara looked at him. What truth? That someone at this ranch knows what they're doing. He left before she could respond. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, outside. Laughter rose from the banquet hall. The celebration continued. The feast she had built with her own hands was feeding hundreds of people. But still, She remained behind the kitchen door, exactly where she had been told to stay. She looked at the cake, at the empty room, at her hands, and she wondered how much of a person could be given away before anyone noticed the person who gave it. Then the music stopped. A voice rose from the banquet hall. Vivian Caldwell, and Clara, still standing in the kitchen, heard the first words that would change everything. I want to take a moment to speak about the extraordinary meal you have all enjoyed today. Her voice carried easily through the open doorway between the kitchen corridor and the banquet hall. Vivian had always known how to speak to a room. That was something Clara had noticed from the beginning. She never rushed. She never searched for words. Every sentence seemed carefully placed, like a piece on a chessboard. Clara stood beside the work table, her hands resting against the edge. The kitchen was suddenly too quiet. The fires had been lowered. The last dishes had already been carried out. For the first time all day, Clara had nothing left to prepare, nothing left to fix, nothing left to keep her mind busy. Outside, 200 guests listened, and Clara listened too. Many of you have asked who created such a remarkable feast, Vivian continued. There were murmurs from the guests, approval, curiosity. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment. Perhaps, just perhaps. She thought Vivian might say her name, not because she needed praise, not because she wanted attention, simply because it was the truth. The food had come from her hands. The recipes had come from her family. The hours had belonged to her. She opened her eyes. Then she heard Vivian laugh softly. And I want to be honest with all of you. Something in Clara changed. Not yet pain, not yet anger, just a small warning, like a storm beginning far away. The meal you enjoyed today was the result of careful planning and guidance. Clara's fingers slowly tightened around the edge of the table. Of course, we hired a local woman to assist with the cooking. The words landed gently, almost kindly. That made them worse. A widow from the area. A few guests murmured. Clara stared at the floor. She knew exactly where this was going, Vivian continued. She worked hard. I will give her credit for that. A pause. But a celebration like this requires more than simple effort. Outside, someone laughed. Clara felt the sound before she fully heard it. Every detail had to meet a certain standard. Vivian's voice remained pleasant, confident. As the bride, I took responsibility for ensuring everything reflected the quality expected of this occasion. Clara did not move. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. She followed instructions well, Vivian said. A few more laughs. She understood what was required. Clara looked toward the doorway. Through the small opening, she could see pieces of the banquet hall, the white tablecloths, the guests holding glasses, the flowers she had arranged, the plates she had prepared, everything she had built. And yet somehow, she was not part of it. She is a hard-working woman, Vivian continued. Then came the words Clara would remember long after the wedding was over. But when you hire someone of that sort, you learn to manage expectations. Silence. A strange silence, the kind that comes right before people decide whether something is acceptable. She is not someone accustomed to important gatherings. A few people laughed. Clara stood perfectly still, not because she was unaffected, because she had learned long ago how to survive moments like this. You did not react. You did not give people the satisfaction of seeing the wound they created. You simply endured. Vivian continued speaking. She has a simple life, a small farm, limited experience. Another laugh. She knows her place. That sentence hurt more than the others, not because it was new, because it was familiar. Clara had heard versions of it since she was young. Know your place. Be grateful. Do not ask for more. Do not expect to be seen. The words changed over the years. The meaning never did. A chair moved somewhere in the banquet hall. Someone whispered. The celebration continued, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen. May appeared in the doorway. One look at Clara's face told her she had heard everything. Clara. Clara did not turn. She's finished. May stepped closer. Clara, I'm fine. The words came automatically. Too quickly. May knew that. I know you. Clara looked down at the table. The same table where Caleb had sat every morning. The same table where he had asked questions about bread and pie crust. The same table where she had almost convinced herself that maybe she was more than what people saw. I should finish cleaning. May shook her head. You don't have to. Yes. Clara began gathering the serving cloths. Her movements were calm, careful. Gentle May watched as she untied her apron. The simple white apron she had worn every day for 6 weeks. The apron that carried flour stains and small marks from hours of work. She folded it, placed it on their counter. Then she removed the kitchen cloth from her shoulder. The room became very quiet. You're leaving, May said softly. Clara picked up her knife roll. Yes, wait for Caleb. Clara stopped, only for a second. Then she shook her head. No, Clara, he has enough problems today. May looked at her. That is not what this is. Clara wrapped her mother's cast-iron skillet carefully. It is exactly what this is. She placed it inside her bag. I came here to do a job. Her voice remained steady. I did the job, May swallowed. You deserve better than this. Clara looked toward the banquet hall. The music had started again. People were celebrating, a wedding, a future, a life everyone had planned. I think, Clara said quietly, I deserve to go home. She lifted her bag. The door behind the kitchen opened. Neither woman heard it at first. But then a voice came from the doorway. Clara. She froze. She knew that voice. Caleb Whitmore stood there. He was still dressed in his wedding clothes, dark coat, white shirt, a silver watch chain across his vest. But something about him looked different. Not the calm ranch owner who drank coffee before sunrise, not the man who always knew what to say. This was a man who had just heard something he could not ignore. His eyes moved from Clara's packed belongings to the empty space where her apron had been, then back to her face. You're leaving. Clara held the bag closer. Behind him, the music continued. People laughed. They had no idea what was happening inside the kitchen. Caleb stepped forward. Because of what she said, Clara looked away. Because my work here is finished. That is not what I asked. She was quiet. Caleb lowered his voice. What she said was wrong. Clara gave a small, tired smile. Was it? The question stopped him. She said I was hired to cook. You were. She said I was supposed to stay out of sight. Caleb said nothing. Because that part was true. Not because he believed it. Because he had allowed it, Clara noticed. And that hurt more than Vivian's words. I need to go, Mr. Whitmore. She moved toward the door. Caleb did not block her. He would never do that, but he stepped aside slowly, looking at her as if he was trying to find the right words. He did not. Not yet. Clara reached the doorway, then stopped. Because behind her, Caleb Whitmore finally turned toward the banquet hall, toward the room where his bride was still speaking, toward the people who had listened. And for the first time all day, the sound of the wedding celebration seemed to disappear. Caleb took a breath. Then he walked away from Clara, not because he was leaving her, because there was something he needed to face, something he could no longer pretend was someone else's problem. And Clara stood in the doorway holding her bag, watching the man she had spent 6 weeks trying not to care about walk back toward the very room where everything had broken. She did not know what he was going to say. She did not know what choice he was about to make, but she knew one thing. The quiet cowboy who drank coffee before sunrise was gone, and the man walking into that banquet hall was finally ready to be heard. Caleb Whitmore stepped through the kitchen doorway and back into the noise of the wedding. For a moment, nobody noticed him. The fiddle continued playing, guests continued talking, glasses were raised, the celebration moved forward as if nothing had changed. But Caleb had changed. He stood at the edge of the banquet hall and looked across the room, at the tables filled with food Clara had prepared, at the guests praising a meal they believed belonged to someone else, at Vivian standing near the front, with a smile that belonged to a person certain she still controlled the room. Then she saw him. The smile on her face faded slightly, only slightly, but Caleb noticed. "Caleb," she said. The nearby conversations began to quiet. People sensed something. They always did. A room full of people could feel when the air shifted. Caleb walked forward, not quickly, not angrily, just steadily. Vivian lowered her glass. "What is it?" Caleb looked at her. For years, he had respected Vivian's family. He had respected their wealth, their influence, their connections. He had convinced himself that respect was enough to build a marriage on. He had been wrong. "Did you mean what you said?" Vivian's expression changed. "About what?" He looked toward the kitchen, then back at her. "About Clara." A silence spread through the room. Vivian glanced around. She understood immediately. The attention she had wanted all day was now on something she had not planned. "She is a worker, Caleb. That is not what I asked." Her face tightened. "You are making a scene." "No." His voice remained calm. "That already happened." Several guests looked down. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Vivian placed her glass on the table. "You are upset because of one speech?" Caleb shook his head. "I am upset because I have spent 6 weeks watching someone give everything she has to this ranch, while everyone around her acted like she should be grateful just to stand behind a door." A few people became very still. Vivian crossed her arms. "She was hired to cook." "Yes." The answer surprised her. Caleb continued. "She was hired to cook, not to be insulted." The room was silent now. Even the musicians had stopped. Vivian looked at him. "Are you truly doing this?" Caleb did not answer immediately, because he knew exactly what the question meant. Not just this conversation, not just the wedding, everything, the land agreement, the expectations, the future everyone else had planned. And finally, he understood something. A person could spend years avoiding one difficult decision. Then one day, that decision would arrive anyway. "I should have spoken sooner," Caleb said. Vivian's expression softened for the briefest moment, almost like she expected him to continue with an apology. Instead, he continued. "I kept telling myself that staying quiet was kindness." He looked around the room. It wasn't. Vivian stared at him. "You are ending this because of her?" The question moved through the guests. Caleb heard it, and he knew Clara would hear about it too. That mattered, because the truth was not what people assumed. "No," his answer came clearly. "I am ending this because of me." Vivian said nothing. Caleb took a breath. "I should never have agreed to a life I did not choose." A murmur moved through the crowd. At the far side of the room, Vivian's father, Henry Caldwell, stepped forward. "Caleb." His voice carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed. "This is not the time." Caleb looked at him. "I know exactly what time it is." Henry's expression hardened. "You have guests here. Yes, you have agreements. Yes, you have responsibilities." Caleb nodded. "I do." A pause. "And one of those responsibilities is not pretending." The room stayed silent. Henry looked toward Vivian, then back at Caleb. "You understand what this means?" Caleb did. The ranch, the business arrangement, the eastern acreage. The support he had expected from Vivian's family. All of it. "I do." Henry lowered his voice. You are making a very expensive mistake. Caleb looked toward the windows. Beyond them were the fields, the land his father had built, the land his family had worked for years, the land he had almost traded away because he was afraid of disappointing people. No, he said quietly. I made the expensive mistake when I ignored what I already knew. Vivian looked at him. For the first time all day, there was no performance in her expression. Only surprise. And something else, something closer to hurt. You never loved me. Caleb did not look away. I respected you. That answer seemed to hurt more than an easy lie would have. Vivian nodded slowly. That is what I thought. The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the silence of the room. Then she looked toward the kitchen, toward the place where Clara had stood hidden all day, and something unreadable crossed her face. Caleb did not wait. He turned and walked back towards his kitchen. The guests watched him go. Nobody stopped him. Nobody knew what to say. Inside the kitchen, Clara had not moved. She still held her bag, still stood near the doorway. When Caleb returned, she looked at him, not with hope, not with expectation, only concern. What happened? Caleb closed the door behind him. The sounds of the wedding became distant. I ended it. Clara looked down. Caleb, I want you to understand something. She shook her head. You should not have done that because of me. I didn't. The answer was immediate. She looked at him. I ended it because it was wrong. He stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough for her to hear him clearly. I should have known before today. Clara looked away. You had a whole future planned. No. His voice softened. I had a future planned. The difference stayed between them. Clara tightened her grip on the bag. You are going to regret this, maybe. The honesty surprised her. Caleb looked toward the kitchen table, the same table where he had sat every morning. But I would regret staying more. Clara did not respond, because she knew that feeling, the feeling of staying somewhere because leaving seemed impossible, the feeling of carrying a life chosen by other people. Caleb looked at her. I am sorry. For what? For letting you believe this was acceptable. The apology was simple. No excuses, no explanations, just the truth. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she lowered her eyes. I need to go home. Caleb nodded. He did not ask her to stay. He did not try to make her decision easier. And somehow that made the moment harder. Because for the first time, Clara understood that Caleb was not trying to save her. He was respecting her. She moved toward the back door. Outside, the Montana afternoon stretched wide and quiet. The same road that had brought her here 6 weeks earlier waited beyond the ranch gate. She stepped outside. Behind her, Caleb remained in the kitchen, a broken wedding behind him, an uncertain future ahead. And between them stood the one thing neither of them could ignore anymore. The truth. Clara Bennett left Whitmore Ranch before the sun reached the highest point in the sky. She did not rush. She did not look back. Her wagon moved slowly along the dirt road that led away from the ranch, the wheels rolling over the same path she had traveled 6 weeks earlier when she arrived with a box of tools, her mother's skillet, and the hope that $40 could save her home. Now the wagon carried the same things, but Clara was not the same woman who had arrived. The Bitterroot Mountains stood in the distance, quiet and unchanged. The fields moved beneath the summer wind. The world continued as if nothing important had happened. That was the strange thing about difficult moments. People always imagined the world would stop, but it never did. The horses still needed feeding, the crops still needed tending, the sun still rose, and a person still had to decide what came next. Clara reached Pine Hollow just before evening. Her small farmhouse looked exactly as she had left it. The fence leaned slightly near the northern corner. The roof still needed repairs. The porch steps still creaked beneath her boots. But when she stepped inside, she felt something she had not expected. Relief, not happiness, not yet. Just relief. She placed her bag on the kitchen table. The room was quiet. Her room, her kitchen, her stove, her life. For the first time in weeks, nobody was telling her where she belonged. She unpacked slowly. The knives went into the drawer. The cast-iron skillet returned to its place above the stove. The folded apron she had worn at Whitmore Ranch stayed inside her bag. She did not take it out, not that night. The next morning, Clara woke before sunrise. Habit. She stared at the ceiling for a few moments. For 6 weeks, she had woken knowing exactly what waited for her. The Whitmore kitchen, the bread, the coffee, Caleb sitting at the end of the table. Now there was only silence. She got up anyway. She lit the stove. She made coffee. She fed the chickens. She repaired the loose section of fence near the barn. Work was easier than thinking. Work had always been easier. Over the next several days, Clara returned to the rhythm of her old life. She fixed what needed fixing. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She planted vegetables in the garden behind the house. The roof became her biggest concern. Every time it rained, she placed a bucket beneath the same weak spot in the bedroom ceiling. She hated that bucket. It reminded her of every year she had spent trying to hold things together. One afternoon, she climbed onto the roof with a hammer and a box of nails. The wind was stronger than she expected. She sat there for a moment, looking across her land. 40 acres. Not much compared to Whitmore Ranch. Not impressive, not valuable to most people. But hers. Every fence post, every patch of grass, every stone along the old path near the barn. She had fought to keep it, and she had. That mattered. When she climbed down, her hands were scraped and her back ached, but she smiled, just a little. The next week, a letter arrived. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope, May Ellis. She opened it at the kitchen table. The letter was short. May told her the wedding guests had left. The Caldwell family had returned east. The ranch was quieter. Caleb was working, that was all. No dramatic details, no gossip, no attempts to explain what happened. Just the truth. Clara appreciated that about May. She never added more than necessary. A second page was folded inside. Clara unfolded it. It was a note from a man named Walter Hayes, a rancher from Laramie. May explained that he had attended the Whitmore wedding and remembered the food. He wanted to know if Clara would consider preparing a dinner for a cattlemen's gathering in September. The payment offered was written at the bottom. Clara stared at the number. It was more than she expected. Much more. She placed the letter down, then picked it up again. For years, she had cooked because she needed to, because bills needed paying, because someone had to make meals. But this was different. Someone wanted her work, not because she was convenient, not because she was hidden away in a kitchen, because they remembered what she had created. A few days later, Clara wrote back. She accepted. The first person she told was May. When May arrived with supplies and a basket of preserved fruit, she found Clara measuring flour. "You accepted." Clara looked up. "Yes," May smiled. "I knew you would." Clara shook her head. "You did not." "No." May sat at the table, "but I hoped." Clara placed the measuring cup down. "It feels strange." "What does?" being asked. May looked at her. "Because you are used to being needed." The words stayed in the room. Clara did not answer. Because they were true. Being needed was not the same as being valued. She was only beginning to understand the difference. Meanwhile, back at Whitmore Ranch, Caleb Whitmore was learning his own lessons. The ranch had survived, but not without consequences. Without the agreement with the Caldwell family, several planned investments disappeared. Supplies became more expensive. Some neighbors questioned his decision. Some thought he had thrown away an opportunity. Others respected him for it. Caleb listened to all of them, then he went back to work. He repaired fences, he checked cattle, he rode the eastern acreage every morning. The land his father had built everything on, the land he had almost given away. One evening, he sat alone in his office reviewing old documents. The original agreement with the Caldwell family sat on the desk. Beside it was the letter from their attorney. The wording was polite, but the meaning was clear. They believed Caleb had damaged their arrangement. They believed he would eventually regret his choice. Caleb folded the letter and placed it away. He did not regret ending the wedding. That was the one thing he knew, but he regretted something else. He regretted waiting so long to understand what mattered. The next morning, he walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was quiet. No Clara, no fresh bread cooling near the window, no notebook beside the flour bin, no coffee cup waiting at the end of the table. He stood there for a long time. The room felt larger than before, not because anything had changed, because something was missing. Caleb poured himself coffee. He sat in the same chair, the same place where he had spent so many mornings, and for the first time, he understood how much those ordinary moments had meant. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were honest. He did not send for Clara. He did not write. He did not ask May to convince her to return. That would not be right. Clara had spent her entire life being told what she should do. He would not become another person making decisions for her. So he waited. Not because he expected anything, because she deserved the freedom to choose. And far away in Pine Hollow, Clara Bennett stood beneath her repaired roof, looking out over the land she had saved. The woman who arrived at Whitmore Ranch, believing she only needed to earn enough money to survive, had discovered something much more important. She had a name, she had a voice, and she had finally begun to understand that being seen was not something another person gave her. It was something she already deserved, but understanding something and believing it were not always the same thing. Clara Bennett learned that slowly, one morning at a time, one decision at a time. The September Cattleman's dinner in Laramie was the first time she cooked for people who knew her name before they tasted her food. That mattered more than she expected. When she arrived at the gathering, she did not enter through a back door. She did not carry her supplies through a hidden hallway. She walked through the front entrance of the small wooden hall with her recipe book in one hand and her basket of ingredients in the other. Men greeted her. Women asked questions. The organizer, Walter Hayes, shook her hand. "Miss Bennett, we are glad you came." Clara almost looked behind her to see if he was speaking to someone else, but he was not. He was speaking to her. The dinner went better than she hoped. The guests praised the smoked meat. They asked about the bread. Several people requested copies of recipes. One rancher even told her that his wife had been trying to make biscuits like hers for years. Clara laughed softly. "I think the secret is patience." The woman smiled. "My husband says the secret is not burning them." That helps too. For the first time in a long while, Clara laughed without checking whether she was allowed to. When she returned to Pine Hollow, she found herself thinking about something strange. The Whitmore wedding had been the largest event she had ever cooked for. Hundreds of guests, a grand ranch, a beautiful celebration, but the Laramie dinner meant more. Because this time, nobody asked her to disappear. Nobody told her where she belonged. Nobody treated her work like it had appeared from nowhere. Her name came with it, and that changed everything. The following weeks passed quietly. Clara continued accepting small jobs, a ranch supper here, a holiday gathering there, nothing extravagant. Nothing that turned her into someone she was not. She still lived in her farmhouse, still repaired fences, still woke before sunrise, still used her mother's cast-iron skillet. Her life did not become easier overnight, but it became hers in a way it had not been before. Then one cool afternoon in October, she saw a familiar horse standing near her fence. She knew the horse before she saw the rider, a dark brown gelding. Caleb Whitmore's horse. Clara stood on the porch steps. For a moment, she did not move. Then Caleb removed his hat. Clara, Caleb. The distance between them felt different than it had at the ranch, not because it was smaller, because neither of them was pretending it was not there. He looked toward the repaired roof. You fixed it. She glanced up. Yes, how long did it take? 3 days. He nodded. I thought it would. That almost made her smile, almost. You came a long way to ask about my roof? No. The answer was simple, honest. I came because there are things you should know. Clara stepped aside. Coffee? Caleb looked surprised. Then he smiled faintly. I would like that. The farmhouse kitchen was smaller than the one at Whitmore Ranch. The table was older. The chairs did not match. The stove was not as large. But when Caleb sat down, he looked around carefully, not comparing, appreciating. This feels like you. Clara placed the coffee pot on the table. What does that mean? He thought for a moment. I'm not sure. A small pause. I just mean it feels honest. She looked away. That word again. Honest. It was something Caleb had been searching for. Something Clara had been protecting without realizing it. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The Caldwell family is finished with the land agreement. Clara looked at him. What happened? I found documents. He reached into his coat and removed a folded paper. Not an official contract, just copies of letters. The eastern acreage was never only about the railroad. Clara read the first few lines. Her expression changed. They wanted more than your land. Caleb nodded. They were pressuring smaller ranchers nearby. Why? Because once the railroad route became official, those properties would become more valuable. Clara looked down at the paper. They planned to buy people out. Yes, a quiet moment passed. And you stopped them? Caleb looked toward the window. I tried. That answer was very Caleb, never claiming more than he had done, never making himself the hero. Clara folded the papers. You could have told me. Yes, why didn't you? He looked at her. Because I did not want you to think I was telling you this to make you forgive me. The honesty of that answer stayed with her. You think I need to forgive you? Caleb looked down at his coffee. I let you walk into that kitchen. His voice was quiet. I saw how Vivian treated you from the beginning. Clara said nothing. I told myself it was not my place, a pause. But sometimes staying out of something wrong is just another way of allowing it. The kitchen became still. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, Caleb continued. I should have protected your dignity before I ever needed to apologize for failing to do it. Clara looked at him. She had expected excuses. She had expected explanations. She had not expected accountability. That was harder to resist. Caleb, he looked up. What are you asking from me? His expression softened. Nothing. The answer surprised her. Nothing, not today. He placed the cup down. I came because you deserved the truth. Clara studied him. The truth about what? He hesitated, then answered. That I did not end that wedding because I suddenly realized I cared about you. The words were gentle, but because I finally admitted I had been living a life that was not mine. Clara looked toward the window, the same way she had looked at her own land weeks earlier, trying to understand what came next. Caleb stood. I should go. She walked him to the porch. At the bottom step, he stopped. Clara, yes? He looked back at her. I am glad you are doing well. The sentence was simple. No request, no expectation, just happiness for her. And somehow, that was the thing that stayed with her after he left. Not the apology, not the explanation, the fact that he had come all this way and asked for nothing. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table with the lamp burning low. Her recipe book rested beside her. Her mother's skillet hung above the stove. The house was quiet, but it was not lonely. She thought about Caleb, about the man who had once sat at the far end of her work table before sunrise, about the man who had walked away from a wedding because he could no longer ignore what was wrong. And she realized something. The first time Caleb saw her, he had seen a woman who could cook. Then he saw a woman who could solve problems. Then the woman who understood the land. But Clara was finally beginning to understand something else. She did not need him to see her for her to have worth. She only needed to decide whether she wanted him beside her while she continued building the life she had already started. And for the first time, that choice belonged entirely to her. The first snow of the season came early to the Bitterroot Valley. Not much, just enough to cover the fence posts in a thin white line and leave the mountains in the distance wearing their winter caps. Clara Bennett stood outside her farmhouse with a basket of firewood against her hip and watched the flakes disappear into the dry grass. Winter used to mean worry. It meant counting supplies, checking the roof, wondering if there would be enough money when something broke. But this year felt different. Not because life had become simple. It had not. The barn still needed repairs. The old wagon still rattled on the southern trail. The stove still needed attention on cold mornings. But Clara no longer looked at those things as proof that she was alone. She looked at them as proof that she had built something. Her own place. Her own life. 3 weeks after Caleb's visit, another letter arrived. This one was not from May, it was from Caleb himself. Clara recognized the handwriting before she opened it. The letter was short. It did not ask her to come back. It did not ask her to forgive him. It simply said he would be passing near Pine Hollow on Friday, and wondered if she would allow him to stop by. Nothing more. No pressure, no promises. Clara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside her recipe book. Friday arrived cold and clear. She found herself looking toward the road more often than she wanted to admit. When Caleb finally appeared, he was not dressed like a wealthy ranch owner. No formal coat, no polished boots, just a dark wool jacket, worn gloves, and the same hat he had worn every morning in her kitchen. He tied his horse near the fence, then he walked toward the house. Clara opened the door before he knocked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was familiar, like those early mornings before sunrise. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning." He looked past her. "Coffee?" A small smile touched her face. "You came all this way for coffee?" "No," he paused, "but I would not refuse it." She stepped aside. "Come in." The farmhouse kitchen was warm. A kettle sat on the stove. Bread cooled near the window. The smell of cinnamon filled the room. Caleb removed his gloves and sat at the table, not at the end. Not like a guest waiting to be served, just at the table. Clara poured 2 cups. For a while they talked about ordinary things, the weather, the cattle, the repairs Caleb still needed to finish before winter. The new orders Clara had received from nearby ranches, small things, real things. Then Caleb placed his cup down. "Clara." She looked at him. "I need to tell you something." Her hands rested around her coffee cup. "All right." He looked toward the window, then back at her. "When I came here before, I told you I was not asking anything from you. You were not. I meant it." A pause. "But I also knew there was something I needed to say eventually." Clara waited. Caleb had always been careful with words. That was one of the things she trusted about him. He never filled silence just because silence existed. "I spent most of my life believing responsibility meant doing what people expected." He looked down at his hands. "My father built Whitmore Ranch from nothing. I respected that. I wanted to protect it." Clara nodded. "But somewhere along the way, I confused protecting something with giving away pieces of myself." The room was quiet. "I almost married someone because everyone told me it made sense." His eyes lifted. "And then you walked into my kitchen." Clara looked away. "Caleb, I know." His voice softened. "I know what that sounds like." She looked back at him. What does it sound like? Like I am saying you changed my life. A pause. And maybe you did. He shook his head slightly. But not because you saved me. Clara listened. You did something much harder. What? You reminded me who I was before I started trying to be what everyone else needed. The words stayed between them. Clara looked down at her coffee. For years, she had wanted someone to see her. But now she understood something. Being seen was only the beginning. The person who truly mattered was the one who saw her and still respected the woman standing there. I'm afraid, she admitted. The confession came quietly. Caleb did not interrupt. I spent years being the woman people overlooked. She swallowed. I know how to work. I know how to survive. I know how to take care of everyone else. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. But I do not know how to believe someone wants me beside them. Caleb sat very still. Then he said the only thing he could. I know. She looked surprised. You do? Yes. He leaned forward slightly. Because I watched you spend 6 weeks proving your worth to people who should have recognized it before you ever lifted a knife or touched a mixing bowl. Clara looked out the window. The snow was falling harder now. I do not want to be rescued. I know. I do not want to be someone's obligation. I know, and I do not want to disappear again. Caleb's answer came without hesitation. Neither do I. She looked at him. He continued. If you ever feel like you are disappearing, I want you to tell me. A small pause. And if I ever make you feel that way, I want you to walk away. The honesty surprised her. You would let me? No. A faint smile appeared. I would try very hard to convince you to stay. Then his expression became serious, but I would never ask you to become smaller so I could keep you. For a long moment, Clara said nothing, then she stood. Caleb watched as she walked to the shelf above the stove. She reached up and removed her mother's old apron, the same apron she had carried to Whitmore Ranch, the same apron she had worn when she believed her only value was what she could make for others. She held it for a moment, then folded it carefully. This belonged to my mother. Caleb nodded. I know. She taught me that food made with care could bring people together. A small smile. She was right. Clara placed the apron back on the shelf. But I think I spent too many years believing that was the only thing I had to offer. Caleb stood. He did not move toward her until she turned back. That small choice mattered, she noticed. I have a question, he said. All right. When I come back next week, a pause. Would you like me to come back? Clara looked at him. Not because she needed time to decide, because she wanted to answer honestly, yes. The word was quiet, but it carried. Caleb smiled, not the smile of a man who had won something, the smile of a man who had been given something. Trust. Outside, the snow continued falling over the valley. Months later, when spring returned to Montana, the wedding was nothing like the one that had nearly happened at Whitmore Ranch. There were no wealthy guests from the East, no business arrangements, no one measuring the value of a person by their name or their land. It was held in Clara's yard, the same yard where she had repaired fences, the same place where she had stood alone and wondered if her life would ever become something more. Neighbors came. Ranch hands came. May arrived wearing a blue dress and carrying a basket of flowers she claimed were not arranged properly, even though everyone knew she had spent 2 days making them perfect. The mountains stood beyond the valley, the sky stretched wide above them, and Clara Bennett walked toward Caleb Whitmore, not as a woman being chosen, because someone had finally noticed her. She walked toward him as a woman who had already chosen herself. Caleb took her hand. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her on those first mornings, with attention, with respect, with certainty. The minister spoke, the vows were said, and when it was finished, Clara looked around, at the people who knew her name, at the table where everyone would eat together, at the home she had fought to keep, at the man standing beside her, not in front, not behind, beside, and she finally understood. The greatest love was never finding someone who completed what was missing. It was finding someone who saw everything you already were and chose to stand beside it. Because sometimes the hardest journey is not finding someone who loves you. It is learning to believe that you were worthy of love all along. Imagine standing where Clara stood, carrying years of quiet struggles, wondering if the world would ever look past what it saw on the outside. Imagine giving everything you have, your time, your heart, your hands, and still feeling invisible. Then imagine meeting someone who does not ask you to become smaller, quieter, or different. Someone who simply sees you clearly. That is the kind of love Caleb and Clara found. Not a perfect love, not one without fear or mistakes, but a love built on honesty, respect, and the courage to choose what is right even when it costs something. Clara's story reminds us that our worth is not measured by who notices us first. Sometimes it takes one brave moment, one honest person, or one second chance to help us remember the value we carried all along. If you were standing in Clara's place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would truly love to hear your story, and if stories of love, healing, courage, and unexpected second chances touch your heart, consider subscribing. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you in the stories ahead.